Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, SAR. This has been an exciting group of talks to put together, made difficult by how many wonderful people there are who have worked on these issues. And the three people I'm sitting with tonight are very distinguished, and I'm very humbled to be sitting at the same table with the three of them. The NAGPRA was an interesting law, or is an interesting law. It deals with a product. It deals with a materiality of people's consciousness and the intangibles of culture and societies and people. NAGPRA has done some wonderful things. People approach a museum and they request the return, the repatriation, and perhaps those two objects go back to the community. But what about the 998 other objects that remain with the museum? What is the relationship like? What are the other consequences of bringing those pieces back? There may or may not be a way to bring those back into the community. So what we really began to talk about in terms of exploring through these panel discussions was what's next. NAGPRA has been a nice start. It's had its great triumphs. It's had some difficulties as well. But what's next? What's been left out? And really the key issues that we're going to talk about tonight are what were some of the key issues that led to the actual writing of the law, and how has the law functioned, and what doesn't the law cover? Now, and primarily through all this, I'm going to ask the panelists to speak about what's next. We thought about a keynote presentation for these discussions, and we could only whittle it down to 3 people. So we have each of these are a keynote discussant, this keynote presenter. And first, to my immediate left here is Regis Pecos from Coe Pueblo, who received his undergraduate degree in political science at Princeton. He's working on his PhD at University of California, Berkeley. He served as lieutenant governor and governor at his Pueblo of Coe. He also served 16 years as executive director of the New Mexico Office of Indian Affairs. Welcome, Regis. Next is Dr. Joe Watkins, and he is currently the supervisory anthropologist and chief of tribal relations and American cultures at the National Park Service. There must be an acronym for that.
There is, but it takes longer to say the acronym.
Okay. And he's a member of Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. His BA in anthropology is from the University of Oklahoma, and his MA and PhD in anthropology are from Southern Methodist University. He's also been an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Mexico and director of Native American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And you've seen a little bit of Brian already, but somewhere in here I have Brian's career just whittled down to a page. Brian's currently the director of the Indian Arts Research Center here at the school. He's a former lieutenant governor at the Pueblo of Acoma and has also assisted his community by serving as the director of historic preservation, and he was the founding director of the Haku Museum. And he led the planning and design of the beautiful building, and if you haven't been there yet, shame on you. He also did a great deal with the community in terms of the preservation of the San Esteban Del Rey Mission Church and Convent at Acoma. He's also taught at UNM and been a museum director at the Indian Cultural Center. With that, I'm going to try and lay out some questions here. We have not a long time, but I think we'll be able to hit some of the issues. And we're going to leave the questions to the end. We're going to do about an hour, a little bit more than an hour, asking our 3 keynote speakers to address these issues, and then come back to questions from the audience. So appreciate your patience. So I just wanted each panelist to tell us a bit about their experience with NAGPRA and other cultural issues as well. I don't think it's possible for any of them to just talk about a law and not talk about it personally from the individual or community side. And I know that I think that Joe and Regis were both involved in the drafting of the law itself, so maybe there's something there you could talk about. And I'm just going to go down the line here, and Regis, if you'd tell us a little bit about your experience with NAGPRA.
Yes, I believe so.
Let me first express my appreciation for the opportunity to just reflect on my personal experiences throughout the process. Um, there are several layers of my experience. Well before the law was passed, I was involved in the repatriation of two major items of great importance to Coche de Pueblo. One were the stone lions. Another was an object lost to the Pueblo and to one of the societies. And this happened in the late 70s. From that experience, when I was thrust into the process in dealing with the framework of the substance of the legislation. And then soon after it passed, was a very difficult time with two very personal experiences. One was the repatriation of over 100 human remains excavated and warehoused during the construction of the 10th largest man-made lakes in this country, Cochiti Lake. And dealing with that on such a personal level and how excruciating it was to deal with something when there was no process, to be able to do something that we all knew was necessary. And it was a time when my grandfather was nearing 100 and just could not comprehend something so painful. And yet understanding and appreciating that it was the right thing to bring those remains home. And then to deal with my father, who I was blessed to work with, and really looking at the difficulty of the taboos associated with no process in place, and then ultimately bearing the responsibility to lead the process with regard to the responsibility in fulfilling a sacred trust for the return of the remains, but also the delicate balance of having to deal with the religious leaders who did what was necessary to honor and respect the remains, but to do it in a way that was distant, to not know where the remains were reinterred, but left that responsibility to the Corps of Engineers who did the excavation. So a very different experience, and seeing the excruciating pain and difficult in dealing with something that is so personal. And then to have the experience of one of the other largest repatriation of human remains from the Peabody to Pecos, Pueblo, and accompanying the delegation from Jemez, Pueblo to Peabody. And seeing firsthand in that process the difficulty of the religious leaders in dealing with the spiritual nature and how powerful that was, that brought them to degrees of emotion I had not seen or experienced. But how beautiful it was in what they did to share that here are the spirits crying, one longing to come home, but expressing and sharing the great joy of the opportunity to come home. And what it took, that was a very complex process of the journey home, that took negotiations from dealing with the military and bringing them home on a cargo plane, and at critical times, elders and cultural leaders saying that's not appropriate. Because as human remains and the spirit leaves us and our home and our homeland, it is on the back of those living that they journey on. And so the complex negotiations of bringing them home on semi-trucks, and to see the migration of the people of Jemez on foot as that journey started from Boston, and the incredible, miraculous ways that was evidence that the convergence of something so deeply important became clearly evident when the trucks came on I-40 almost at the exact time that the people who had walked from Jemez to the back roads and trails through Cochiti back to Pecos would meet at the same time, at the same place. And how powerful it was, that process that was public to the people of Jemez in celebration and honor and extending respect for the reinterment of those remains. And then I want to share something else that I just heard recently to put into context how important this is to all of us as human beings. Just recently watching the news of parents losing their son in a tragic accident and having the remains cremated. And before they could journey home so that their son could spiritually begin his journey home, to have lost their vehicle. Someone stole their vehicle, and in that vehicle the remains of their son, and how almost paralyzing the pain that the mother shared on air. That clearly is an example of how deep our relations and the sanctity and respect accorded to those who pass on. But imagine 100 remains and how magnified that is onto a whole community of people. So that's one reflective part that I want to share. But I think always there is a value to reflect upon what we've learned. And what we've learned, I think, through the forced relationships of those who have the responsibility to care for such intimate and deeply valued, I'm going to say objects, and that's not respectful to use, but for our understanding. What it forced people in terms of becoming caretakers and guardians and stewards of something so intimate to the lives of people, in this case, indigenous peoples of this country. But what that did to, one, redefine relationships in a really powerful way that, as I reflect, those are incredible, valuable lessons that everyone engaged in the hierarchy across the spectrum have become, I believe, better people by that experience, to appreciate some fundamental core values we all share. The third part that I want to share is really what this whole process of public discourse did to really unveil something very horrible about the history of this country. That the United Nations would recently declare that some of the ways in which this government justified and rationalized some of the most horrible policies purposely conceived that resulted in taking and stealing some of the most intimate aspects of humanity, to call that among some of the worst crimes against humanity. And this process unveiled that for us to see and how terrible it was. But in that process, it heightened the awareness of the public in very intimate ways with those directly engaged in the care for things that it's not their fault, but inherited responsibility. So one of the great lessons for me as I reflect upon that process is to really appreciate what sometimes gets forced upon us leads to incredible levels of understanding and appreciation that unites us in ways that, absent these forced, sometimes resistance to dealing with extending fundamental civil rights, fundamental human rights, fundamental respect for the sanctity of things associated as we sent loved ones on their journey. And so, just very quickly, to provide a context, that's what I value so deeply about this process. And it's been very painful in the deepest parts of my spirit as a human being to have gone through that whole process. And it's everything as a part of that experience that I've tried to use to work on complex issues to affect change where it's necessary, so that we are being humane in the things that matter most, that is part of our shared existence as human beings in this world. So, thank you.
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're sitting. It's something that I learned from some Australian Aboriginal counterparts, that it's something that land never forgets who we are. It never forgets who's walked on it, who has nurtured it. So whenever I get in a public forum, I try to remember to acknowledge that existence. Secondly, I've been doing archaeology for 48 years now. I started way last century, at a time when archaeology really didn't have relationships with people. Many of the archaeologists I knew liked doing archaeology because they didn't have to interact with living people. That time period was a time when human resources or human remains were seen as cultural resources. It was a time when definitions abounded about archaeological cultures that never really related to existing people. Luckily, perspectives have changed. Many of the people who are getting degrees now recognize that we, as archaeologists and anthropologists, have a very shared and very important responsibility to the people whose cultures we have studied. I got involved with the entire repatriation discussion, I guess, in 1979. As a result of the passage of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, the United States government held 10 consultations with tribal groups across the United States. In South Dakota, Oregon, Nevada, Hawaii, Alaska, here in Zuni, New Mexico, in Oklahoma, in Kuala Boundary in North Carolina. I was lucky enough to attend 6 of those consultations and really to listen to people talk about how people of the past, how the way they were treated had extreme and important lasting impacts on the cultures that exist today. There were many archaeologists, many other people who listened or who heard the consultations and the discussions, but I'm not sure that they really listened to what was being said. But some of the important aspects that came out of those consultations, a report was written in 1979, given to Congress, and it delineated some very important ideas that many American Indian groups held important. One was return of cultural objects. It was control or protection and return of cemeteries and human remains. It was really maintaining control over what museums and archaeology, anthropology, the information that was being given out to the public. So in 1979, a few interesting people got together in Washington, D.C. to write this report. Suzanne Schoenharjo, who last year won a presidential medal. Walter Echohawk, the original Bunky Echohawk. James writing in, Vine Deloria. There was a lot of conversation, a lot of joking, a lot of very important discussions that came out of it. And truly, that was the roots that led to the passage of NAGPRA in 1990. Since that time, over the past 25 years, I've had various relationships with repatriation. Some with museum work, some with federal agencies, worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs for 10 years. At the time when all the inventories, the summaries, when the federal agencies and museums were required to provide these to tribes. The 7 tribes I worked with in southwest Oklahoma were getting boxes and boxes of materials, and they really didn't know what to do with them. They kept saying, they're telling us they have these materials, but we don't know if they're ours. Some tribes didn't have ceremonies whereby they could rebury tribal members because they always felt that the first time they buried them, that was forever. And so some tribes would not rebury human remains, but they would allow other tribes to rebury for them. I've been a member of the Repatriation Committee for the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma for the last 6 years, and each time we have a repatriation, the individuals who participate, I think, find new common ground that we never really recognized that we had previously. We learn from each other. We interact with each other in a much different level than we ever have before. Some of these elders are 25 years old. Some of the elders are in their 80s and 90s, and I feel very honored to be considered an elder, at least in this process. I still see myself in my mid-30s, mid-40s. I turned 65 last month, and it was a very rude awakening. I mean, and it was, the scary part was getting all these emails from AARP and from Medicare and Medicaid, and but it's been an interesting process, and really watching how anthropology has shifted even within the last 15 years has been wonderful. The people who are getting their degrees now, those who hadn't really gone to graduate school pre-NAGPRA, have a different level of understanding about our responsibilities and relationships, not only with living, existing communities, but the communities that we encounter as we are undertaking excavations, as we are maintaining and protecting museum collections. And so we're learning different ways of being good stewards, not only for the materials that we encounter on a day-to-day basis, but also for the cultures that have derived from those materials. I currently, the Park Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Program is within my portfolio in the National Park Service. And so on a daily basis, I get some request either from a park or from someone who deals with parks about information relating to the materials that are covered under NAGPRA, and many times the materials that aren't covered under NAGPRA. We're also looking at trying to find ways to make international repatriations easier. The law itself doesn't deal with international repatriations, and so it's forcing us to look at different ways to think about different aspects of what it is we do. The next 25 years are going to be interesting. I think that as we get more students who have different backgrounds taking over what it is that we've tiptoed around at times, then I think it's really going to change.
So I think my formal introduction to, NAGPRA was while I was the lieutenant governor or tribal official for the community, something that you're appointed to. So it was kind of forced on me, and it hasn't gone away. But I must say that my initial introduction to archaeology, this Western archaeology, occurred when I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and sitting in the home of my great-grandfather who served as governor 37 years, different times in his lifetime, who also was led the Acoma land claims settlement for many, many years. And I recall the conversations of the land claims committee in my great-grandfather's home with the archaeologist who was the late Dr. Alfred Bitter, who was sharing information with this group of old men and this young Acoma kid hanging out with them, just eavesdropping. And so those initial conversations, the initial introduction and hearing about this term archaeology just kind of stuck in my mind. And I could understand the conversations that were that was happening among the old Acoma men who were on the land claims committee about, I wonder where those remains are, or those people are. Where did they go, and whatever happened to them? Asking those types of questions of the archaeologist, Mr. Ditter, who I later on in my lifetime I got to know very well. So those memories always stayed in the back of my mind, and like I said, it wasn't until much later that I actually became more familiar with several initiatives, including some of those that Regis spoke to. And it's always just been an interest to me. And then I got pulled in as a tribal official, and that's really where my work in this area began. And like I said, it hasn't gone away. And fortunately, in my position here at SAR, I have the privilege of continuing the conversation with the communities who are represented in our collection about how we can improve a process, how we can partner, and how we can collaborate with the communities and with others to make sense of the collections that we are stewards of, and to allow and provide every opportunity that we can to engage the communities with these collections. Thankfully, you don't have, storage. We're not renting any storage facilities storing human remains and funerary objects. I'm really grateful for that. But I've been to, when I was the director of the Historic Preservation Office at Acoma, and traveling with tribal leaders and religious leaders from my pueblo to NMAI in New York and other institutions throughout the country, and seeing boxes and boxes and boxes and shelves, layers and layers of materials labeled Acoma, Pueblo, New Mexico, that wasn't accounted for. They were just there. And so I reflect on those conversations with the Land Claims Committee in my great-grandfather's house, like, where are they? And I said, well, several thousand of them are right here. So it's very powerful, it's very moving, it's sometimes you can't describe it. And I say that it hasn't gone away, and it won't go away, because there's still so much work to do. And so I'm grateful that we have individuals like Regis and other governors the past and current leadership who are knocking on Joe's door and and forcing the conversation and asking to have the conversation. And I'm really grateful to continue to be a part of that process.
Thank you, all three of you. I think you've done a really wonderful job in summarizing some of your experiences and also revealing some of the very personal nature to the audience, which I think is so important in this. I want to turn the conversation next to what's next, to some of the things that the law itself has not helped with as much as it might have. You know, there's a cost to, the cost of doing anthropology has been quite high in even those of us who are involved in some of these past activities. That legacy always follows anthropology and museums no matter where we go. And part of that has been this continuing conversation, and I think that the conversation built through those years of NAGPRA, but now it's about expanding that conversation. And I want to focus on something that we used a great deal to discuss NAGPRA was the idea of letter of the law as compared to spirit of the law. And I propose to the panelists that we talk about this as tangible and intangible. Because in the NAGPRA is very much based on this materiality, and it's product-oriented. But what I really would like each of you to speak about, I'm going to start on the other end, Brian. What I really like each of you to talk about is maybe in particulars or maybe more general on some of the unexpected consequences of NAGPRA. The need for communities to reveal information or divulge information they don't wish to, the proprietary nature of certain types of knowledge, and like you all have mentioned, the bringing home of people that were once sent away. So I'm wondering if you could then comment then on some of the difficulties that NAGPRA has created for communities. And Brian, if you could start with that, appreciate it.
Sure. I think some of the initial challenges, at least within Pueblo country, included, this issue of this burden of proof. And, tribes, including Acoma, received numerous inventories of the materials that are stored in various institutions. And, let me step back here. When these inventories were arriving, some of the Pueblos didn't know what to do with them, or they just were not prepared. What do we do with these? And so tribal councils were forced to have a conversation about what to do. And so there was no level of preparedness on the parts of the Pueblos and probably many tribes throughout the country. And we were supposed to react and respond and verify information and provide a lot of information back to the institutions. But then again, this issue of cultural affinity to the items on the lists. For Acoma, it was over 300,000 objects. What do you do with that? And then later on, as the process, we became more engaged in the process, and Pueblos were being more engaged in the process, and claiming affinity to some of these materials, including, of course, the human remains and associated affinity objects. There was then this issue of the burden of proof. Well, if this is in fact Acoma, or this is in fact Taos, from Taos, provide us with the information that substantiates this claim. And it wasn't enough to say that, yes, this is ours. And for patrimony items, it became very contentious, because many of the pueblos share very similar traditions, observances, and materials in ceremony. And so there may have been, thousands of objects that we were all reviewing that were identified as Pueblo, New Mexico, or labeled as Acoma, Zuni, Laguna, or whatever combination. And we all had a concern for that one object, or those 1,000 objects. And we all felt like it needed to come back. But then it created this tension. And in some cases, for some of those objects, we're still negotiating. And so those pieces remain in the collections of institutions. So things like that I felt were like the most challenging, and it still are challenging for tribes. There's been some resolution, but where cultural affinity is concerned, I think there still needs to be some discussion about how that process can become much more refined and less burdensome and painful. The other thing quickly is, tribes had to create a process like kind of overnight. If we were repatriating human remains and associated funerary objects, and we agreed to do that, then we had to come up with a process for reburial. As Regis indicated earlier, and for all of us in the room, you bury your loved one and you're kind of done, right? What do you do in this case of the return of human remains and those associated objects? How do you reinter? What's that process? And so having this discussion internally is very painful. And many tribes still have not come up with the process. And as has already been indicated, some tribes will revert to the process of another tribe. In the case of this relationship in the West with the Western Pueblos and Hopi and Navajo, Acoma has taken a lead in the reburial of human remains. With the establishment of the Acoma Historic Preservation Office and its advisory board, they have taken that leadership role on behalf of the tribes, that consortium of tribes. So they've approved the process, and so they're engaged in reburial, and it's just mind-boggling. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of human remains. I believe the last number on the Acoma record was that Acoma has reinterred close to 2,900 human remains. And so the process is working. It's a slow process. It's an expensive process. So these are, just some of the challenges that I see that we're working towards overcoming, but still need some help.
I'm going to skip over to Regis to be able to, Regis will speak more locally, and then we can go to look at a much broader level of the field.
Okay, sure.
So, Regis.
I want to respond to this by sharing two very extreme points on the spectrum. One is positive, the other one is negative. The negative one I'll take first. What this whole process has done with something so intimate from a purely cultural perspective is to impose and westernize a process internally. In an environment where there really is no room for that, but in doing what everyone felt deeply was the right thing to do, argued vigorously to have the opportunity to have this right recognized. Now, the difficult part becomes when the discussion is internalized and how explicitly the relationships with certain objects, with societies, in a community where not everyone is privy to that knowledge of their role and the intimacy of the use of these sacred objects. Now, in this kind of imposed Western process, we see right before our eyes the imposition and infringement in having things that are known only to certain societies become public. And you almost get forced to engage in sacrilegious activities in the name of doing the right thing that you've been forced into. Does that make sense? And an incredibly heart-wrenching process that sometimes is really hard to resolve, and it creates turmoil. Because there are very defined covenants, and as Brian makes reference to the burden of proof, in a very personal way, we went through a process in terms of meeting the test of the burden of proof, all the way up to the highest levels in the federal government, arguing and prevailing that it ought to be done in private. Because in this process, we were internally violating our own covenants of secrecy by being forced into this American jurisprudence framework about the burden of proof. And in the process, creating for unacceptable circumstances where those who are going to be called upon to make the argument in this burden of proof framework, you run the risk of violating some very fundamental covenants that is well known when you do, you're going to be banned and ostracized in the name of protecting something so important to the maintenance and the spirit of your culture. And that's kind of the turmoil that we got forced into, but knowing that that was the right thing to do, but what layers it created in terms of being subjected to walk the tight rope in terms of doing what's right, but in doing what's right, running the risk of engaging in sacrilegious activity. It really is just a very complicated scenario internally. One of the things to appreciate in terms of the spirit of the law and the cumulative effect that goes well beyond repatriation is the kind of culminating ways in which it opened other doors to create and change policy as it provided in one, laws that recognize the important place of native languages, and creating in statute protection and the maintenance and preservation of indigenous languages. What it did to expand the opportunities by way of the framework and foundation of the law to make possible arguments in the return and reacquisition of Aboriginal homeland. So kind of looking at the cumulative effect, as you mentioned, that we have to appreciate in the way that the American Indian Religious Freedom, the American Civil Rights Act, the Indian Civil Rights Act, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, the Native American Languages Act, the many and multiple ways in which lands were reacquired, all have some complementing effects in leveraging the change of policies necessary or laws to create for the convergence of the spirit of this intent that is not just very narrowly defined to something so important as NAGPRA is. So on the very positive side, the cumulative effect is very expansive in terms of the stretch of the spirit and the intent of the law. On this other extreme, just to appreciate the really difficult imposition and infringement that it caused, that in some ways are scabs that when you re-engage in these discussions, it's like peeling that scab and it bleeds all over again. And yet it is within the realm that is supposed to be the strength of our people in the maintenance of healthy mind, body, and spirit, as that realm in its purest sense provides. And in some ways, doing what was right in promoting and prevailing in the reality of this law creates for some very difficult issues internally that are very difficult to resolve, if you even can. You just have to live with it.
Again, here we go. I think that some of the unintended consequences of NAGPRA have been very positive and as well as very negative. I think one of the most positive aspects I see is the fact that there is a cohort of American Indian people who are trained to take over management, protection, and stewardship of this material, both in terms of what is seen as a Western way of managing museums, but they also have some of that knowledge. They have relationships with community, which allows them to create a hybrid approach to materials. They recognize the living spirits within the materials that are in their care. They recognize that there is an energy that, if it's bound up, can become explosive and can become dangerous. But they also recognize that there are ways of harnessing that energy to create ways to help the community flourish and prosper. So I see that as a very important aspect, is that we have tribal museums, we have tribal culture centers, we have people who are devoted to bringing these materials to life again in this contemporary world. On the negative aspect in relation to NAGPRA itself is the fact that museums were the groups, the people, the organizations that determined whether or not an object met a definition of sacred or item of cultural patrimony. And some museums have played that to their own advantage. The Sam Noble Museum of Natural History has within its collection some of the most tremendous materials of American Indian culture from the Spiro collections. Huge, very sacred pipes that were a part of community settings. So the museum approached the Wichita tribe of Oklahoma. They approached the Caddo tribe of Oklahoma because those are probably the two most appropriate culturally affiliated groups to that Spiro collection. The Wichita tribe said, these are sacred objects. We want them back. We need to rebury them because there's no one alive who has the ability to control the power that's within these. And no one should ever really see these unless they are of a particular standing. The Caddo tribe said, these are our culture. They demonstrate to our children today how important we were 1,000 years ago. They we can use these to demonstrate that the cattle culture has been so far advanced in the past and can be that powerful again. If we get these materials, we will create a culture center and we will display them proudly. So the museum, Sam Noble Museum said, well, until such time as you two decide how to deal with these materials, we're going to keep them in our collection. They don't display the originals, so far as anyone knows. I talked to some curators. The originals theoretically are in the back in the collections and no one gets to see them, but what's displayed in public, doesn't really say, trying to think if I see, it doesn't say that it's a replica. So it's one of those questions of authenticity and whether or not the visitor experience is enhanced through looking at authentic materials. In the future, I think that it is this new community of curators, of registrars, and it's really the fact that tribal communities are taking on the responsibility to tell their own stories. And they're not really relying on non-tribal archaeologists as much as they used to. There are some tribes that do because they don't want any of their tribal members exposed to any of the dangers. And so it doesn't matter if a non-Indian is exposed to it because it doesn't have the same impact. So I think that we'll continue to see a burgeoning growth in the number of tribal people who take on some of these responsibilities. And I think we're also going to see within the next 10 years, probably the biggest thing that's going to happen is the big question about culturally unaffiliated, or culturally unidentifiable human remains that are, it's going to be the next big issue under NAGPRA.
That has the potential to throw us into a realm of politicization of something totally inappropriate, as these are to us. But it's another one of those unintended consequences of imposition that creates unrest. And, in this whole process, Brian will appreciate in the Carrot's language, a whole new word evolved, combining two short phrases. One is imi, which is an expression of fear. Amo is an expression of sympathy. And my grandpa would always repeat this every time the issue came that included the elders of the community. And he would sit, and he was blind, and he would sit, and his only response to really share the depth of how excruciating these decisions were, to be dwelling in areas that were consciously known to be inappropriate, but absolutely necessary to deal, again, to do the right thing. And his only response was, imi amo. And it became a new expression of these two ways to express fear and sympathy at the same time, and that was the only way that he could respond to something that he was deeply troubled. And some of that age will say that a lot of the dysfunction and imbalance in the communities today is clearly the result of having taken that necessary step to share how difficult this was, to argue to have that right extended, to not see things so intimately part of the most sacredness of your culture and the highest honor and respect that you accord those who transition in their journey, whose journeys were disrupted, and now in that disruption, they will never be able to fulfill their contribution because their disruption in their journey has caused them to be disconnected. And is there really a way possible to reconnect them? Becomes a very fundamental issue internally that is on the periphery, that in trying to do the right thing, you are now engaged in sacrilegious activity in ways that deepen this burden, in ways that sometimes are unforgivable. So it's almost a no-win situation sometimes, but you do the best you can because you've been compromised in this whole process. It really is a difficult, one of the most, I think, difficult things that we have been forced into, at the same time understanding how the removal of things so intimate was as extreme in the first place, and now it comes back to haunt us in equally extremely difficult ways.
He doesn't want to follow Regis either.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you so much for all those comments. I mean, just some of the depth involved and that comes out of the communities is so important to think about. And it kind of leads to my sort of final question. We have a few more minutes. And I really want to focus on what you've talked about without speaking about it again, without the need to speak about it again. But what's missing from the law? You know, what's next? That's what we've discussed a bit. But what's the next version of NAGPRA? Is there a next version of NAGPRA? Or is it a brand new law? Or can there possibly be a law that legislates some of the things that you've talked about, some of the words about principles and values and sanctity and things like that? And what would that law possibly do? You talked a bit about some of the language that's in NAGPRA about the unidentified remains, and the idea that 25 years later, that isn't it surprising that remains, human remains, are still in the University Museum's collections? So I'm wondering, Joe, we're going to start with you this time.
Okay.
It just next version of the law, or is it a brand new way of thinking about this? What have we really learned that's going to advance and continue to expand the conversation?
I think the biggest shortcoming of NAGPRA itself is the fact that it does not apply to private land, private museum collections, private ownership. In the United States, of course, private property is one of the biggest driving issues. There are issues abound with trying to get human remains out of universities. Alabama has approximately 6,000 sets of human remains in their coastally unidentifiable list. The state of Alabama could be relatively easily divided among the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Creeks. Each one of those groups would like to have the materials back. They would like to have them reburied. Right now, the museum says, what the university says, we're not going to follow the culturally unidentifiable regulations because we believe they are unconstitutional and that they are not good law. And so they are in the process saying, well, we're not going to abide by it, sue us if you want to. So the idea of still that human remains can be property, they can be owned and controlled, and the idea that anyone born in what is now the United States prior to 1500 is not American Indian or Native American is kind of it's beyond my belief. But, so that's going to be the biggest thing, is trying to find ways to implement the intangible aspect of NAGPRA, which is that Native American human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony should be under the control of American Indian tribes and should either be reinterred or handled in such a way that the particular tribes would like that material handled. I think that is the one thing that probably will never happen. And wishful thinking, I think that another version of NAGPRA could take that on. But again, it's that idea of private property. I bought this Plains medicine bundle at Sotheby's auction. I paid X amount of money for it, and it's mine, and it doesn't matter whether the Lakota or the Cheyenne or Arapaho want it back. I'm a good steward of it because it's private property, and so I have it protected against destruction. So it's trying to find ways of helping perhaps the next generation understand that stewardship and ownership are two totally different perspectives.
It is a big question, and there are a lot of unknowns because the implementation is not on a level playing field. I mean, you have some tribes who are engaged, others who are not. You have tribes who have developed some very sophisticated internal processes for implementation of this law. And I guess that's part of the good news, is that it's forced us to think internally about how we engage. It's also, there's this issue of consultation has taken leaps and bounds. It's a federally driven idea that has now impacted activity on state levels, where now there are now mandates within state policy law that require consultation with tribes, and certainly in the private sector, this is also it happens. There's consultation that happens, not only within museums and cultural institutions, but even in the business sector. So I think there's capacity that's tribes have built some capacity in terms of managing these affairs. I believe there's a much stronger voice of Native America on issues and that impact policy. It's pretty amazing to me when I hear some of the stories associated with NAGPRA that throughout the country, where the tribal voice is actually taken into consideration, and something good happens as a result. And usually that good is what the wishes of the tribes are. And I think that's setting the stage for perhaps a conversation about a new law, or amendments to the existing law that will strengthen those successful aspects of the law, but also begin a conversation about some of these other issues, including intellectual property. So I see that it's a positive movement, and even while it's a heavy load to bear on the tribes. As Regis indicated, well, both gentlemen have indicated, it really is necessary, and it's forcing some really positive change on all levels. So, I suppose that with my own community, I can see that we will continue to do what we're doing because I think it's understood finally. 25 years later, we also understand, and in understanding this, we also we say imi almu, and I guess if that can be our response to all of this, then that's okay.
I think when we reflect upon some of the major policies in this last 100 years, but really focusing on re-examining the 1968 Indian Civil Rights Act, and what was good intent still imposed some unintended consequences as an ultimate result, right? Tribes are now re-examining 80 years later the impacts of the imposed constitutional framework caused by the Indian Reorganization Act, trying to make sense of undoing that imposed framework to free themselves, and if it's possible, to move back into an indigenous governance framework. When we reflect on the unprecedented access to resources that the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act brought, now 30-some years later, a lot of the work we do is to really examine what really have we done that is fundamentally different, by asking, what are we doing differently today from those times when others were in control and we were critical of? Because if all we are doing is replicating what we've been critical of, now we have internalized in many different ways the kind of oppression and the impositions and infringements that now is internalized. And we now, as elders, our ancestors prophesied that there could be a time in our journey that we could become our own worst enemy. Okay? So when we move from that kind of period now to examine, 25 plus years, the impacts of NAGPRA, what have we learned and how can we move forward? My idealistic view, I think, consistent of what's already been shared, is there a way that we can begin a series of discussions, which is why what's happening here is so significantly profound, in having this kind of shared discussion to develop levels of awareness to appreciate and work towards an understanding of what can we do together. It becomes important now to engage your earlier reference of what it took to articulate the needs for this law. And I think now is the time to go back to have similar discussions around the country regionally, to really have the really frank and honest discussions of what have been the benefits and what have been the unintended consequences and what have we learned. And so out of that, I think my idealistic vision would be, is there a way to combine this? Because I think that there is a very small percentage of what is archived that realistically could become part of something that becomes a public contribution of our history, that we are in control of that narrative. But the larger percentage really, I think we have come to understand has no place for us to now be engaged in what we otherwise have been critical of museums doing for so long with those things most personal about who we are. That it could somehow lead towards combining the absence of a major provision that we could not prevail to secure in the American Indian Religious Freedom Act on the provisions for the protection of sacred sites as a right within the constitutional framework, so that we can get beyond the kind of cost and benefits where we lose within an American jurisprudence framework when we argue against roads that desecrate places of worship for a road that leads to a major recreation area. How does that make sense? And is it the same application that if a road were going through St. Francis Cathedral, is that possible? So we're still far from being fair and just in the applications of very fundamentally important principles that is about us and not us against you. It's part of our humanity, the maintenance of the sacredness of who we are as people that should be our common agenda. Now, is it possible that with all of the lands that are now outside of our reach as a matter of jurisdiction that is now within the hands largely of federal agencies, whether it's the National Park Service or the Bureau of Land Management or the National Forest or the National Monument, is there a way that the traces of the large percentage of what is archived can actually find their way back home to these places and be able to solve the issue of land rights using what was taken from these areas as part of the sacredness of their place in this world that we all believe deeply that they have a role to play that is equally important for all of us and the roles we play while physically part of this world. And is there a way that in these discussions we can find a means to address the remaining issues that NAGPRA brings that is largely inappropriate, that we would ever invest in museums for the larger percentage of what is going to be inappropriate? And could we converge the absence of the provisions of the protection of sacred lands under the American Indian Religious Freedom? That would be my ideal vision. But it was so hard fought. But Senator McCain, as powerful as he was, prevailed to argue that if you give Indian people the right to protect their sacred lands, they're going to use that to stop every major water project in the Southwest. So that's what we're up against, is that kind of power. But good things have happened that has been the cumulative effect as we reflect upon the hard lessons learned and appreciating what compromises have come, and can we somehow strike a balance. This process is extremely, extremely complex. And the climate today, I think we will all agree, from the time that we all were engaged in this process, is like night and day. And maybe times in our history creates windows enough of opportunity. And whenever we cannot achieve the things that we are deeply ambitious to put into law, those windows close And we may not see in our lifetime another opportunity as we had moving through this process, both with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and NAGPRA. It may be left to another generation, but in recognizing that this is an incredible, important part of a necessary dialogue to create understanding and awareness and appreciation. And if we ask ourselves this question, what do we want future generations to inherit from us? Or let me back up with another question. What do we love most about where we come from? And then this question, what threatens what we love most? And then ask ourselves, what do we want future generations to inherit from us? And the fourth question is, what core value, if we went around this room, would you share that has guided your life to do the things that you have done in your life? And who gifted you that? And when you answer and share that core value, whether it's about love or respect or compassion, or respect or humility, or understanding or forgiveness, it's a very personal reflection of what you share, that when you think deeply about who gifted you that core value, you're going to reflect upon how much love and caring there was, whether it was your mother or your father or your grandpa or your grandma or your auntie or your uncle, that they gave you something to guide you in your life. And if that's the kind of discussion we have, then I think we come to a point and place that we have more in common than not. And if we answer the question about what do we want future generations to inherit from us, that's going to define what kind of caretakers they will become. Will they be loving, respectful, and compassionate? Well, it's this kind of discussion at this stage in our lives, and we celebrate and we're blessed and we're 65 years old. We have to think about these very important questions in the lives that we're blessed with, that remain. What are we going to give to the next generation? And I think that's why this discussion becomes so important, because it lends itself to creating understanding, that as we spread that understanding, it becomes part of a movement that is driven, I think, by a deep sense of love and respect and compassion for one another, to deal with the most difficult parts of our past. And we don't have to point fingers about who was at fault, but we have to acknowledge and appreciate the past and understand that the challenges we face today are deeply rooted in those policies and laws purposefully conceived. But we are of a different time and generation. And as we answer the question about what do we want future generations to inherit from us, then I think we're at a different point. Because the answer to that question is going to be something fundamentally part of a common agenda.